Julius Rosenberg is hereby sentenced to a punishment of death. Morton Sobel is hereby sentenced to a punishment of 30 years imprisonment. Ethel Rosenberg is hereby sentenced to a punishment of death. Well, that was unexpected. I mean, sure, Julius Rosenberg getting the death penalty was always on the cards, but for Ethel, it was much more of a surprise. She is no criminal mastermind. She is simply a mother with 2 young boys at home. The federal government has not executed a woman for over 50 years. However, just before handing down his sentence, Judge Kaufman explained why the severity of the espionage crimes justify the imposition of the death penalty. I consider your crime worse than murder. Plainly deliberate, contemplated murder is dwarfed in magnitude by comparison with the crime you have committed. In committing the act of murder, the criminal kills only his victim. The immediate family is brought to grief, and when justice is meted out, the chapter is closed. In your case, I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resulting casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price for your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. The punishment to be meted out in this case must therefore serve the maximum interest of preservation of our society against these traitors in our midst. The fact that Morton Sobel was not involved in transferring information about the atomic bomb was the only thing that saved him from the same sentence that the Rosenbergs got. Defense counsel Emanuel Bloch had hoped that Ethel's relatively minor role in the plot would save her from the harsh sentence her husband was sure to receive. However, Judge Kaufman explained why her involvement justified the penalty. The evidence indicated quite clearly that Julius Rosenberg was the prime mover in this conspiracy. However, let no mistake be made about the role which his wife, Ethel Rosenberg, played in this conspiracy. Instead of deterring him from pursuing his ignoble cause, she encouraged and assisted the cause. She was a mature woman, almost 3 years older than her husband, and almost 7 years older than her younger brother. She was a full-fledged partner in this crime. In being found guilty and being sentenced to death, the Rosenbergs had lost 2 massive battles. But their war to avoid the electric chair was just getting started. There are not only lawyers preparing to fight to overturn the verdict, but also supporters all across the globe that are preparing for an all-out media blitz to pressure for clemency. It started slowly. For the first couple of months, there was basically no support for the Rosenbergs in the media. Everybody assumed that the Rosenbergs were guilty. Even the left-wing press, at best, would say that the death penalty was harsh, but they didn't dispute the Rosenbergs' guilt. Emanuel Bloch went to the Daily Worker, which was a large communist-affiliated newspaper, and asked them to look deeper into the case. They would always thank him for the suggestion and sometime later inform him that they had decided against assigning resources towards investigating the Rosenberg case. Bloch's fortunes changed when he met the founders of the National Guardian. This was a generally pro-Soviet Union, pro-China weekly tabloid, but it was much less closely affiliated with mainstream far-left politics. They asked Bloch why there wasn't more positive coverage of the Rosenbergs, to which he replied that he wasn't sure. So, they decided to assign William Rubin to write a 7-part expose on the Rosenberg case. Quite frankly, there wasn't much new in these articles. They basically just wrote about the case, giving only the evidence which was favourable to the Rosenbergs. They then drew wild conclusions based on that evidence. Conclusions that no lawyer wanting to win a case during this time would have made in court. They claimed that the FBI was framing the Rosenbergs and that David Greenglass had not actually confessed to the FBI when originally arrested. They insinuated that the FBI forged the notes afterwards and instructed Greenglass on what lies to tell. They also harshly criticized the judge and the jury selection process. In totality, they really brought up only one fact which the jury had not already heard. One of the other Soviet spies, Klaus Fuchs, was often called Julius by his friends and family. This was genuinely new. It didn't come up in the trial. The National Guardian then concluded that the Julius that Bentley and Gold testified about may in fact have been Klaus Fuchs. This was only convincing because the National Guardian never published the fact that Greenglass told Gold that to contact him again, Gold should phone his stepbrother Julius in New York. Is it possible that the Julius was referring to when he said he came from Julius was Fuchs, and that Greenglass coincidentally brought up a completely separate Julius to Gold later? Add to that the Julius David mentioned had nothing to do with the spy ring, but was still being put forward as a point of contact between Gold and Greenglass, whose only affiliation with each other was spying. It is possible, but not realistic. The Julius Bentley brought up could not have been Fuchs though. Bentley testified that she spoke to an agent on the phone who called himself Julius and lived in Knickerbocker Village in 1943. Klaus Fuchs was in England at the time. It would turn out that the fact that the National Guardian's stories consisted almost completely of information the jury had already known when they reached their decision wasn't important. The information was quite compelling, and only seeing the evidence from one side would lead one to the conclusion that the Rosenbergs were clearly innocent and a great injustice had taken place. The stories didn't cause a change in general public opinion, but there was a devoted group of people that became convinced of the Rosenbergs' innocence. Emily Allman was someone who had barely followed the trial, but was galvanized by the articles in the National Guardian. Even if Allman wasn't sure that the Rosenbergs were innocent, the penalty was surely too harsh. So, she decided to contact Bloch and suggested setting up a group to lobby for the Rosenbergs. Bloch believed that it was too late at this point and that nothing could be done. This is October 1951, by the way. Bloch suggested that Allman tried to set up a clothes drive for the Rosenbergs' children. Fortunately, Allman chose to completely ignore Bloch and founded the National Committee to secure justice in the Rosenberg case. Fortunately for me, there are no other committees in this case, because if I had to say the National Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case every time I was referring to this organization, the video would be even longer than it is now. Anyway, the committee did gain some support early on, with $1,300 being raised during the first month. They used these funds to print a pamphlet which was mostly based on the articles in the National Guardian. During this early time, it was quite a wide tent group. Membership consisted of civil libertarians, Jewish organizations, some socialist, and also people just generally opposed to capital punishment. There were people in the group who thought the Rosenbergs were completely innocent, and others that thought they may have been guilty, but there was enough doubt that they should not be executed. Others still believed the Rosenbergs were guilty, but the punishment did not fit the crime, and others were principally opposed to the death penalty in all cases. What all the members had in common was that they were mavericks and they didn't follow the mainstream. Allman invited William Rubin, the author of the articles in the National Guardian, to join the group. Rubin agreed and suggested they also bring in Helen Sobel, Morton Sobel's wife. This happened to be a great decision, as Helen turned out to be the committee's best speaker and most convincing member. Many people would in the coming years join the group or donate money, having been convinced by Helen Sobel's appeal. In many ways, it is ironic that it was Helen Sobel who would be a major contributing factor to the committee's success, given that her husband was often the forgotten black sheep of the Rosenberg case. The energy was behind the Rosenbergs, and the committee focused almost all their energy on their story and their case. The committee slowly grew. Small fundraisers would be organized by members. These were advertised alongside well wishes for the Rosenbergs, which had become a near constant in the National Guardian. In Detroit, $350 was raised through donations at a dinner party held for the Rosenbergs. An American studying in China sent some Chinese stamps to the National Guardian in the hopes that a reader would buy them and give the proceeds to the committee. Events popped up in New York, New Jersey, Chicago, and LA. The committee organized a speaking tour where they went to a couple of major cities to preach the injustice of the Rosenberg case. One of the first events in New York got just 85 attendees. Future happenings would be slightly more popular. The committee is slowly growing and converting more people over to their side, but it is all still very small scale. One night, a man knocks on Emily Ullman's door and tells her to stop the Rosenberg thing. Ullman doesn't know for sure whether he was sent by anti-Rosenberg groups or the Communist Party. Either way, Ullman knows that it is a just cause and threats were not going to make her back down. The support for the Rosenbergs in public was undoubtedly a positive development for them, but if they wanted to avoid the death penalty, they would need to win in court. Originally, the Rosenbergs were sentenced to be executed in late May 1951, so just 2 months after their trial finished. This was never going to happen though. The Rosenbergs were entitled to an appeal and the execution would be stayed until that was complete. Bloch had nearly a full year to work on his arguments for a new trial. Here is what he managed to muster. Firstly, Schneider, the photographer who claimed that he took passport photos of the Rosenbergs, should not have been allowed to testify. He wasn't on the witness list. The prosecution had to give a list of witnesses to the defense before the trial. The prosecution did do that, and they had over 100 names on it. Of that massive list, only roughly 20 were actually called. But Schneider wasn't on the list. Thus, a new trial must take place with his testimony excluded. Next up, David Greenglass's sketches were improperly included as evidence. They are not evidence at all. They are just recreations from David's memory. If the originals had been introduced, then fair enough, but these recreations proved nothing, and they should have stayed out of the trial. Ellicher testified that Sobel told him that Julia said that he had spoken to Elizabeth Bentley on the phone, but was pretty sure she couldn't identify him. That is a witness telling the jury what another party says they were told by a third person. Obvious hearsay. It should not have been allowed in the trial. But the largest reason why a new trial was justified was due to Judge Kaufman's bias and incorrect charging of the jury. Judge Kaufman let the issue of communism come into the trial and even personally questioned the witnesses about their communist affiliations. Judge Kaufman even said in the jury instructions, quote, "Because of the development of highly destructive weapons and their highly guarded possession by nations existing in a state of tension with one another, the enforcement of the espionage laws takes on a new significance. Our national well-being requires that we guard against spying of the secrets of our defense." By letting the trial become about communism and national security instead of being about the alleged conspiracy, Kaufman gave the jury a green light to find guilt based on emotion rather than evidence. His personal bias was also shown when, while the jury were deliberating and they asked to have Ruth Greenglass's direct testimony read back, Kaufman out of hand rejected Bloch's request to also have the cross read back. That was the cross-examination where Ruth Greenglass basically repeated her direct examination word for word. Finally, Bloch argued that the death sentence was unjustified in this case, since the Rosenbergs were not malicious and the Soviet Union was allied with the United States during the time the nuclear information was passed on. All of those arguments would be ruled on by a panel of 3 judges. If 2 agree with Bloch's arguments, then the Rosenbergs would get a new trial. Judges Swan and Chase might be hard to convince, but Judge Jerome Frank would hopefully be on the Rosenbergs' side. Frank was a civil libertarian and an expert on evidence law. Surely, he would see the problems with some of the evidence that was allowed at the trial, and clearly, he would be outraged by Judge Kaufman's conduct in allowing emotion and not fact to drive the conviction. Although Frank alone would not be enough, if he could convince one of his associates of the justice of the Rosenberg cause, a new trial would be the result. For 6 weeks, the judges deliberated. The Rosenbergs sat in prison waiting. The committee waited, and Bloch waited. Finally, at the end of February 1952, the decision came down. Frank had written it. It was 3-0. They rejected every claim. Schneider didn't need to be on the witness list since he was a rebuttal witness and only called to contradict what the Rosenbergs had testified to. Furthermore, the FBI claimed only to have found out about him the day before, so it would be impossible to put him on the witness list, which was made months earlier. Greenglass's sketches were allowed under the map, diagram and chart rule. The prosecution had made it very clear that these were not the originals, and the jury knew they were recreations made years later when they weighed their importance. As for that Ellicher hearsay claim, the prosecution argued that it was not hearsay since the statement was in furtherance of the conspiracy. That didn't even matter though, since the defense didn't object at the time. Thus, the statement is allowed, even if it is hearsay. As for painting Judge Kaufman as biased and unfair, not really, and definitely not enough to overturn the conviction. Every time that communism came up, Kaufman reminded the jury not to determine the guilt or innocence of a defendant on whether or not he or she is a communist. That determination should be based on the evidence alone. As for Judge Kaufman personally questioning witnesses, this was normal at the time, and it was seen as a judge's job to have the testimony be clear, and there was nothing wrong with the judge asking clarifying questions. Judge Kaufman did speak about the importance of the espionage laws in his instructions, but he was very clear that the jury should not use this as a reason to find the defendants guilty. That must be done on evidence alone. Judge Kaufman was also right not to force the jury to have Ruth Greenglass's cross-examination read back to them during deliberations. The jury asked for the direct examination, and Kaufman made it clear to the jury that if they wanted the cross-examination, they could simply request it. Bloch's arguments against Kaufman's behavior were also seriously undermined by what Bloch said contemporaneously to the issues occurring. Quoting now from Frank's opinion, "Defendant's counsel first broached this suggestion on a motion for mistrial after all the evidence had been heard, said that the judge's alleged fault had been inadvertent, and added that the judge had been extremely courteous to us and afforded us lawyers every privilege that a lawyer should expect in a criminal case. Soon after the denial of this motion, counsel for the Rosenbergs, summing up for the jury, stated that we feel that the trial has been conducted with that dignity and that decorum that befits an American trial. Still later, the same counsel said that the court conducted itself as an American judge. These remarks by a highly competent and experienced lawyer are not compatible with the complaints now made, nor are those complaints deserved. We think the judge stayed well inside the discretion allowed to him." As for the sentence, even if the appeals judges disagreed with it, there was nothing they could do. Some of the arguments Bloch made about the mitigating circumstances were also commented on by Judge Frank. Unless we are to overrule 60 years of undeviated federal precedents, we must hold that an appellate court has no power to modify a sentence. The trial judge, in sentencing the Rosenbergs, relied on the record evidence which, if believed, shows a very different picture. If this evidence be accepted, the conspiracy did not end in 1945 while Russia was still a friend, but as the trial judge phrased it, continued during a period when it was apparent to everybody that they were dealing with a hostile nation. This result was devastating for the Rosenbergs and their family. It was also crushing for the committee, which by this point had exploded to include thousands of people. For about a year, Emily Ullman had been running the committee without much success. They did raise some funds, and surely convinced a few people with their speaking tour, but they were unable to put a dent in the prevailing attitude of the time that the Rosenbergs were guilty and that the execution was justified. Then, suddenly, in November 1952, a huge number of people started joining and donating. Unlike the broad base of people which had previously constituted the committee, the new joiners were generally communists. A split started to develop between the original members and the communists. The communists seemed interested in lionizing the Rosenbergs and having them seen as martyrs for the socialist cause. The committee's founders were just interested in not having the Rosenbergs executed. A good example of this juxtaposition was the editing of the Rosenbergs' letters. For a while now, the Rosenbergs had written letters from prison and they had been published to gain support for their cause. The committee had been editing the letters as the Rosenbergs' writing was not always particularly beneficial to their defense. The original committee members wanted to portray the Rosenbergs as harmless figures falsely accused. So, they would remove the more vindictive and communistic language from the letters. The new committee members, on the other hand, were fine with keeping the letters unchanged, even if they would be harmful in a clemency campaign or appeals to the court. Bloch mediated the dispute and sided with leaving the letters unedited. This led Emily Ullman to question if Bloch was more loyal to the Rosenbergs or to the Communist Party. She didn't say anything publicly though, since infighting would surely just make the committee look bad. To be fair to Bloch, Ullman didn't know the Rosenbergs, and the Rosenbergs wanted their letters published unchanged. The Rosenbergs saw themselves as being the true advocates of American democracy. They saw the US government and court system, which had sentenced them to death, as a fascist perversion of the country's founding principles. Julius believed this to such an extent that he cut out a copy of the Declaration of Independence, which was included in the 4th of July edition of a newspaper. He then hung it up in his cell and signed his name at the bottom to be alongside the founding fathers. Everything, from sports to religion, was analysed as a class struggle by the Rosenbergs. It shouldn't be a surprise that they would also view their trial and sentence through a Marxist lens. Putting the disagreements aside, the influx of communists was no doubt helpful to the committee overall. More money was raised to cover the Rosenbergs' legal bills and fund publicity campaigns. By Christmas 1952, the committee even had the funds to charter a train to bring supporters to Ossining, where the Rosenbergs were being held in Sing Sing prison. There, they sang Christmas carols for the Rosenbergs, who were Jewish by the way. The Rosenbergs did not hear any of the carols, but they heard about the uptick of support and they started believing that if only Bloch could drag out the legal appeals long enough, the public pressure would cause the government to vacate their death sentences. The inpouring of communists into the committee also caused new reasonings to form as to why the Rosenbergs had been found guilty. Not only were they the scapegoats of a scared government during the Red Scare, they were also the victims of an anti-Semitic plot. The Jewish judge and prosecutors were now accused of being fascists. The US government was being compared to Nazi Germany, with the new committee members seeming to find more similarities than differences. The Rosenberg prosecution being an anti-Semitic plot is certainly untrue. However, the trial did bring into the forefront some of the anti-Semitism which was still rather common in the United States at the time. Many newspapers received anti-Semitic letters looking forward to the Rosenbergs' executions. Jewish groups were afraid that the spying of the Rosenbergs, Greenglasses, and Sobel would be extrapolated to a distrust or blame of the entire Jewish community. Thus, American Jewish leaders promoted certain information to prevent this association from forming in the first place. They called it a campaign of propaganda of fact. These included facts about how the Soviet Union oppressed Jews and how American Jews are not all far left and vote across the political spectrum in US elections. They also promoted the stories of Sable and other Jews who had helped in the conviction of the Rosenbergs, and stories of Russian attacks against Israel and Israel's support of the United States in the Korean War. The Jewish community leaders generally didn't call for clemency and were more on the side of the government than the Rosenbergs. Many Jews, however, shared in the opinion that was not uncommon at the time, that even if the Rosenbergs were guilty, the death penalty was exceedingly harsh, particularly in the case of Ethel. The CIA certainly saw potential allies in the Jewish community for their fight against communism. They had a plan to bring rabbis in to talk to the Rosenbergs and convince them that the Soviet Union was anti-Semitic and wanted to exterminate the Jews in their borders. The extermination part is a slight exaggeration, but the anti-Semitic bit is certainly fair, considering that Stalin was doing purges aimed at Jews during this time. The Rosenbergs would be turned away from Soviet communism, and in exchange for clemency, they would appeal to Jews around the world to leave the communist movement. An added benefit would be that the Rosenbergs would surely give more information about the spy ring which still had members hidden inside the US government. It is unknown if the Rosenbergs would have believed the rabbis or simply assumed that they were Western capitalist propagandists. The plan was never attempted. The American Civil Liberties Union was another group that saw not getting involved in the case as a method to gain favor with the government and distance themselves from any communist associations. The ACLU were viewed as the preeminent defenders of free speech regardless of political affiliation in the USA, but they may have veered too far onto the side of holding their tongue related to the Red Scare. They were quiet about the Smith Act convictions of the leaders of the Communist Party in 1948. Those leaders were imprisoned for supporting the violent overthrow of the US government, but they did not carry out any acts in furtherance of that belief. This seems like the kind of free speech issue the ACLU might generally have an opinion on, but in this case, they said nothing. The ACLU were pressured by their membership to get involved in the Rosenberg case, but the board voted 18-4 that there were no civil liberty issues in the Rosenberg conviction. They also found no constitutional problems with the death sentence that Judge Kaufman had issued. A prominent ACLU lawyer did offer to represent the Rosenbergs, but it turned out to be a highly unethical affair. Morris Ernst was approached by some of the Rosenbergs' relatives who were now flush with committee cash to get the best lawyers. They asked Ernst if he would be interested in representing Julius and Ethel. Ernst then inexplicably went to the FBI and asked them if they would like him to represent the Rosenbergs. If Ernst became the Rosenbergs' lawyer, he would have advised Julius and Ethel to admit to the crimes to avoid the death penalty. Ernst may have been more motivated to give this advice because it benefited the FBI rather than because it benefited the Rosenbergs. Luckily, Bloch was not interested in stepping aside, so Ernst's offer to represent the Rosenbergs was turned down. Ernst later spoke to the FBI and claimed to have done a psychological study on the Rosenbergs. He said that Ethel was the ringleader and Julius was just following her orders. Ernst never even spoke to the Rosenbergs. So this psychological study seems to be something he just made up. A horrible lie. The FBI took note of it, but hopefully they didn't take it too seriously. The Rosenbergs' momentum in the realm of public opinion made no difference in court though. At the end of 1952, the appeals court once again unanimously rejected the Rosenbergs' new claim. Bloch argued about press coverage and evidence that shouldn't have made it into the trial, but he was once again hampered by not having made any objections at the time. With that loss in court, the Rosenbergs only had 3 options left. They could appeal to the Supreme Court, but it was unlikely that the highest court in the land would choose to hear their case. They could lobby the president for clemency, but it was unlikely to be granted given the political climate and Truman's Cold War mindset. And finally, they could hope that new evidence would come out. And luckily for them, some of this new evidence had just been in plain sight the whole time. In April 1953, a National Guardian reporter went to Julius Rosenbergs' mother's house for an interview. There, they found the elusive console table that the prosecution claimed the Russians had gifted to the Rosenbergs as a reward for their spying. Through a crazy coincidence, the table ended up there with half the Rosenberg family thinking it had been sold to a furniture dealer, and the other half not knowing about its relevance to the case. So, it was only when a reporter came to the apartment that its importance was discovered. The Rosenbergs' maid, Evelyn Cox, said she recognized the table, but refused to sign an affidavit due to the intense media associated with the case. There was no way to definitively prove its authenticity, and the value to the defense was very limited anyway. The table being found didn't prove that it hadn't been a gift from the Russians. All it did was counteract the claim by Ruth Greenglass that Julius had hollowed out the table to put a lamp inside so he could work on spy material without being seen. That was quite an unbelievable claim in the first place, and probably didn't sway the jury in any way. Suffice to say, there would be no new trial based on the console table alone. Luckily for the Rosenbergs, a new piece of evidence would surface around this time, and it would call into question the reliability of the prosecution's chief witness, David Greenglass. If this new evidence actually was what it looked like, a new trial would be certain. During the time that David gave his first confession to the FBI, he hired a lawyer, and that lawyer did a number of interviews with David at the time. The documents arising from these interviews were secret, secured by client confidentiality. Well, someone got access to those reports and had them published in a French magazine. Wait, a French magazine? Why would the French care about the Rosenberg case? At the exact same time that the committee had the influx of volunteers and money in the United States, in what is surely a pure coincidence, Rosenberg committees started sprouting up in Europe. In England, hundreds joined on the first day. In Italy, public service and dock workers went on strike. But it was France, which was the European epicenter. The group claimed that the Rosenbergs and the Greenglasses were just Jews with no connection to the Communist Party. The article that started much of the Rosenberg mania in Europe claimed that the Rosenberg case was a modern-day Dreyfus affair. The Dreyfus affair was a treason trial of an innocent French army captain at the turn of the century. He was found guilty and later exonerated, with anti-Semitism being a notable reason for the accusation and conviction. The Rosenberg trial was such a big deal in France that prominent intellectual Jean-Paul Sartre threatened that executing the Rosenbergs would cause Europe to sever ties with the US. In France, the view that the Rosenbergs should get a retrial was quite common across the political spectrum. The CIA in Paris even had to release a summary of the case to fight the inaccurate characterizations that were common in the French media. This summary was written without access to any of the FBI or Attorney General's documents. It was based nearly completely on the trial transcript. After reading the summary, the French press, with the exception of the left-wing newspapers, agreed that the Rosenbergs were guilty. But even after many of the French public's misconceptions about the case were cleared up, the view that the death sentences were too harsh still generally persisted. Klaus Fuchs had been sentenced to 14 years in jail in the UK. He gave way more detailed information about the bomb to the Soviet Union. The Rosenberg sentence just didn't make any sense. Anyway, what was actually published about David Greenglass in that French magazine? The confidential files stolen from David's lawyer included an interview with Ruth Greenglass where she said that David had a tendency for hysteria and would run through the house naked. She also claimed that David would say things are so even if they are not. There was a handwritten statement by David where he said it was possible that he told the FBI some information that may have been incorrect, and also a summary of David's story which had basically no mention of Julius Rosenberg. The obvious conclusion to be drawn from this is that David Greenglass gave two versions of events: the true version, where Julius Rosenberg wasn't involved, and then the fake version, where he blamed Julius to save his own skin. Even ignoring that document, the statement from Ruth that David was unreliable and David's admission that he lied to the FBI seriously undermined the reliability of his testimony. In France and the rest of Europe, there was a new wave of people proclaiming the Rosenbergs' innocence. In the United States as well, Rosenberg supporters were buoyed as the calls for clemency were overtaken by the calls for a new trial. This is exactly what the Rosenbergs had needed. Bloch, however, didn't make a new appeal with any of this evidence, which greatly frustrated the Rosenberg supporters. But there was much more to this new evidence than came out in that French article. Firstly, the statements by Ruth were made to David's lawyer during a time when they were considering recanting David's confession to the FBI or pursuing an insanity defense. Her statements probably were not true and certainly wouldn't hold up in court. David's statements about lying to the FBI were actually pretty narrow. He said that he didn't remember what exactly he included in his documents he gave to Harry Gold, since it had happened years earlier. Thus, he may have confused when exactly he gave the Russians specific information. The worst misrepresentation from the article was the apparent statement by David that didn't include Julius Rosenberg. The French newspaper got this by publishing the first and last page of a memo, and just leaving out the middle part where Rosenberg featured prominently. So, the new evidence in total was not nothing, but it would be a long shot. But this was a time for long shots. The Rosenbergs' initial appeal, which Judge Frank had struck down, had been appealed to a higher court multiple times now, and despite the public pressure, the Supreme Court had refused to hear their case. Why not run this new evidence by Judge Kaufman? Well, it might have to do with how it was obtained. The investigation at David's lawyer's law firm showed that the files had been stored in the law library, which they shared with other litigators in the same building. This was bad security, but the documents were still in a filing cabinet, so somebody probably would have to be specifically looking for them in order to find them. Furthermore, the library was only open to legal professionals who would know the importance of client confidentiality and the ramifications of breaking it. But This fact may have made Block even less likely to use this new information in court. His law firm was based in that building, and they regularly used that law library. Even if Block didn't steal the documents himself, it certainly looked like it was him or somebody at his firm. But with the Rosenbergs' execution coming closer, Block felt he had no other choice, so he appealed to Judge Kaufman to get a new trial based on this new evidence. Block presented his arguments to the best of his ability, but it was clear that Kaufman's mind was already made up. After the hearing concluded, Judge Kaufman went back into his chambers for 15 minutes and emerged with a ruling that took 30 minutes to read. He would later claim that this was because he had already received both briefs days before the hearing and had taken detailed notes, which aided him in his writing speed. But realistically, it was clear that there was nothing that Block could say to convince Judge Kaufman. Kaufman had ordered the executions, and he would make sure that they were carried out. The higher courts would not be much help either. The only time that they overruled Kaufman was when the execution was scheduled too soon for Block to make a proper appeal. They refused to give the Rosenbergs a hearing on the new evidence. Perhaps the courts had given up on the Rosenbergs. Or maybe the Rosenbergs' defense just needed a new perspective. Irvin Edelman was a California lawyer who had joined the committee early on. Originally, he was a member of the Communist Party, but he was kicked out for not following the party line. Edelman read the Rosenberg trial transcript and was not impressed by Block. He was shocked to find that Block had impounded David Greenglass's testimony concerning the details of the bomb. This meant that for those portions, all media and spectators had to leave the courtroom. Not only did it make it look to the jury like Greenglass had passed on some super secret information, but the impounding resulted in large portions of the testimony being excluded from the official transcript. Thus, those sections were unavailable to the appeals judges. Edelman sought to publicize Block's errors in order to get the Rosenbergs a new trial based on something akin to ineffective assistance of counsel. Fike Farmer was a Tennessee lawyer who was brought into the movement by Irvin Edelman's arguments. He thought that the Rosenbergs may be saved due to a law that had not been considered by the defense. The Rosenbergs were tried under the Espionage Act of 1917, which was drafted as a response to the first Red Scare. This law was vague, and it was possible that standard communication between scientists in Allied countries would qualify as espionage. Thus, the 1946 Atomic Energy Act was drafted to supersede this vague 1917 law. Under the new act, the Rosenbergs could only be executed if it was proven that they intended to harm the United States national security. This is a much higher standard than what they were tried under. For the 1917 law, it wasn't required that the Rosenbergs had any malice when they transmitted the information. Farmer and Edelman thought their arguments would save the Rosenbergs' lives, so they went forward on their crusade. Farmer went from Tennessee to New York City and met with Block. He put forward his theories, but Block was not interested and sent Farmer home without even properly considering anything. Farmer and Edelman found support in the LA chapter of the committee, and that chapter's lobbying made Block give the petitions a second look. Block could no longer ignore the pair completely, so he simply delayed. He did not respond in a reasonable amount of time and asked the two men to wait until after the Supreme Court looked at Block's current appeal. Farmer felt like he was just getting led along and that Block had no interest in actually reckoning with his theory. Farmer didn't want to undermine Block, but after a while he decided that he had no other choice. If Block was not going to help the Rosenbergs, he would. Farmer and Edelman submitted a next friend petition. which is basically a way a third party could file an appeal for somebody they were not representing. In this case, it was Farmer and Edelman filing a petition on behalf of the Rosenbergs. This certainly seemed to get Bloch's attention, as he invited Farmer and Edelman to New York. But it was not to work with them. Bloch's goal was to finally stop Farmer and Edelman's meddling once and for all. Bloch told them he had written to the Supreme Court and asked them to ignore this next friend petition. The lawyers went home dejected. There was nothing they could do. Surely the Supreme Court would not overrule the defense attorney of record. Next, Bloch surprised everyone by taking the Farmer petition and bringing it to Judge Kaufman. Farmer was overjoyed by this. His arguments would finally get their day in court. Farmer wrote to the committee and they paid for his travel expenses to go to Bloch's hearing. Farmer sat in the gallery as Bloch presented the arguments unenthusiastically and in a way that was almost more aimed at him in the audience than Judge Kaufman on the bench. Judge Kaufman rejected the petition. Farmer was incensed. The Rosenbergs were due to be executed in 6 days. He would not let Bloch hold him back any longer. He would do anything necessary to have his arguments properly heard by a judge. He would not be able to live with himself if the Rosenbergs were executed because he gave up on them. That evening, Farmer met with Emily Allman. She told him that after Bloch's performance at the hearing, the committee will not blindly back him up anymore. The committee's old guard would back Farmer as much as they could. Through another judge, Farmer contacted Kaufman about his petition. Kaufman told Farmer to bring it to the prosecution and he would look at it if they agreed it had merit. That's pretty strange. Anyway, Farmer refused to do that, but he had no way of getting the petition to Kaufman. Luckily, Judge Kaufman received a bomb threat, and in the newspaper article about it, they listed his address. Yes, they literally listed the home address of a judge who was getting constant death threats. Truly strange times. So, Farmer went to Judge Kaufman's apartment building, but was stopped by a uniformed guard who told him to go away. Eventually, Farmer found Kaufman's law clerk and handed over the petition. Judge Kaufman rejected it without a hearing. Both the prosecution and Bloch had sent messages asking him not to accept the petition. Another block in Farmer's way. But at least this time, he was walking away with a ruling. He could now appeal the decision to a higher court. Farmer decided to just start going to judges' houses. After getting no answers at the residences of the justices on the Court of Appeals, he went to Washington to canvass the Supreme Court's homes. After no success there, Farmer found out that Justice Douglas was in his office. Rushing there, Douglas agreed to see Farmer and give him half an hour to plead his case. Farmer put forward a strong performance, and Douglas was so impressed that he stayed the Rosenbergs' execution. Douglas found the argument about the atomic energy law interesting, but Edelman's theory about the impounded testimony is what finally swayed him. Douglas had no idea that any testimony had been impounded, and he was not comfortable sending the Rosenbergs to their death without having seen the full case. Douglas sent the issue back down to the district court. And not a minute too soon, in Sing Sing prison, the Rosenbergs were doing their last visits with family before their execution. They found out through the intercom system that their deaths had been stayed. This decision was nearly the best possible outcome for the Rosenbergs. By sending the issue back down to the district court, they were just one step away from a new trial. Even if Judge Kaufman rejected the appeal, as many suspected he would, they would be entitled to appeal that decision to a much more favorable Judge Frank. Even if it failed at all levels, this appeals process would delay the execution for months, if not years. That is more time for the committee to build support for the Rosenbergs and more time for the political environment to change, to be more favourable to the president granting clemency. And, most importantly for the Rosenbergs, if nothing else, it was time that they could spend together. Justice Douglas's decision was the last of the Supreme Court's summer term, so Douglas went on a cross-country road trip. While driving through Pennsylvania, it was reported on the radio that Chief Justice Vinson had summoned the Supreme Court into a special session to have Douglas's decision argued before a full court. Douglas, incensed, pulled off what I imagine to be a sick-ass U-turn and immediately went back to Washington. Farmer was back in New York, preparing arguments for the district judge when he heard the news. Being flat broke, he had to do a nighttime visit to Emily Ullman to get money to travel back to Washington, where he would argue before the full Supreme Court at noon the next day. Shortly before the hearing, Farmer met with Block to discuss strategy. Block thought it would be a poor decision to argue that the Rosenbergs were prosecuted under the wrong law. This was despite the fact that it was that particular argument which convinced Douglas and got the Rosenbergs this court date in the first place. When they got to the trial, the defense were informed that the arguments were only on whether the next friend petition was valid and the issue of the atomic energy law. The government argued that the 1946 law was only ratified after the Green Glasses and Rosenbergs' crimes had occurred. The defense countered that the conspiracy continued until after the law went into effect, so the whole conspiracy should be judged against that standard. Justice Jackson asked the prosecution if a conviction could be gotten based on the 1946 law, to which they answered no. While that answer may sound good for the defense on paper, in practice, it probably just further entrenched the anti-Rosenberg judges. Now, it was the defense's turn, and they had 90 minutes to wow the judges. They would need to be at the top of their game, since some justices needed to be flipped if the Rosenbergs wanted to make it out of the week alive. The defense lawyers were a team of 4. First, there was John Finnerty, who had been petitioning the court on Block's behalf for weeks. He was trying to get a hearing on the issues Block argued to the Court of Appeals. Now, he finally had his hearing, but it was related to Farmer's petition, which Finnerty didn't know well. So, as you would expect, he didn't stay particularly on topic. He argued that the trial in New York was without merit and the current proceedings were an insult to Justice Douglas. To be fair, it was pretty unheard of to call a special session to counteract a justice's decision, but this might not have been the ideal venue for that argument. Next up was Daniel Marshall. He had spent the past couple of days helping Farmer get his petition in front of judges. The only problem was, nobody knew he was going to speak, not even him. At the defense meeting that morning, it was decided that Finnerty, Block, and Farmer would split the 90 minutes. But now, in front of the entire Supreme Court, Block had given him the nod. To say he was unprepared would be an understatement. He mostly complained about the less than a day notice period the defense had had. This is a fair complaint, but it's probably not going to be very convincing to the justices who had decided to hold a meeting on such short notice. At one point, Farmer even stood up and interrupted Marshall from the gallery. He told the court that he didn't need more time and he was ready and looking forward to presenting his case. Next up was Block. If the defense had been bad so far, Block was atrocious. He took his time, eating up much of the 90 minutes available, spending most of it asking for another hearing at a later date when he would be more prepared. Even worse, he actively undermined Farmer's case. He said it was a very technical fine distinction of law, downplaying the significance of Farmer's argument. It was so bad that at one point, Justice Black asked him, Mr. Bloch, you represent the Rosenbergs, do you not? And it's your duty to try and save them from the electric chair if possible, is that right? To which Bloch responded affirmatively. Then, Mr. Bloch, at this late hour, whether these points that have been brought to your attention are big ones or little ones, don't you think you ought to espouse them rather than denigrate them? When Bloch vacated the floor, Farmer only had 17 minutes to save the Rosenbergs. He didn't think he had enough time to bring up the atomic energy law and the impounded testimony, so he decided to take the atomic energy law contention and defend it to the best of his ability. He gave it a good shot, but overall, the defense had been woeful. Of the 90 minutes, most of the time was spent on topics unrelated to what the court was considering. The impoundment issue, the fact that the 9 men on the Supreme Court would be sending the Rosenbergs to their deaths without having access to the full record, wasn't even mentioned. The Rosenbergs lost 5-4, with one of those 4 not being on the merits, but simply being a protest vote to the special session being called. As painful as it would be to believe that the defense's poor performance is what caused the loss, the truth is maybe even sadder. Commenting on the deliberations, Justice Frankfurter wrote, "The fact is that all minds were made up as soon as we left the bench. Indeed, I have no doubt before we met on it. Most of the time in conference was consumed by consideration whether the results should be announced that afternoon or delayed until the next day noon. There was no discussion of the merits." Maybe, if Farmer would have had the full 90 minutes, he could have made a difference. Or maybe this entire appeals process that had seen Farmer and Edelman crisscross the country for months was futile from the start. Either way, it was now clear that the Rosenbergs would not be saved by the courts. The Rosenbergs' last hope lay in the hands of newly elected President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The campaign for clemency was where the committee really came into their own. Bloch's arguments in court, which had been ineffective in convincing judges, were successful as propaganda to the public. The committee was growing larger, and many members were convinced of the corruption of the judiciary. Every time the death penalty was upheld, supporters pushed even harder for clemency. After Kaufman rejected the Rosenbergs' second appeal, a picket line formed outside the White House. In 1 week, the White House got 21,500 telegrams and letters asking that the Rosenbergs be spared. The committee also successfully got prominent physicists like Albert Einstein and Robert Urey to call for clemency. Einstein had previously been closer to the movement, but had distanced himself after the communist takeover. He was still against the Rosenbergs' execution though. David Greenglass also asked for mercy for his sister and brother-in-law. The Rosenbergs' oldest son, Michael Rosenberg, wrote a letter to the White House asking Eisenhower to set his parents free. The FBI did a handwriting analysis on that letter. They found that Michael had written it himself, but in later years, Michael admitted that the contents were dictated to him by an adult. Overseas, the campaign may actually have been bigger than in the United States. The Pope, having been lobbied by many Catholic Rosenberg supporters, sent an envoy to Truman asking for mercy. Truman was unlikely to be persuaded by the Pope's appeal, but we will never know because the envoy never reached him. In Britain, demonstrators threatened to cause chaos during the inauguration of the new Queen if the Rosenbergs were not granted clemency. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Poland offered to grant asylum to the Rosenbergs. Huge surprise here, the United States decided to turn that offer down. In France, the Archbishop and 4 former prime ministers wrote an appeal to Eisenhower asking the Rosenbergs be spared. France was still the focal point of Rosenberg support abroad. Newspapers were filled with articles about the Rosenbergs, and posters, like this one, were plastered on any surface possible in many French cities. The American ambassador to France wrote to the US State Department that the executions were likely to have serious long-term effects for American foreign policy. Many French people thought the Rosenbergs were innocent. Others opposed the sentence, but nearly all saw the punishment of Ethel as particularly harsh. She was just an accessory to the crime. Julius had been the driving force. The French ambassador sent another telegram. This one was addressed to the White House and suggested that Eisenhower should take France into account when deciding on clemency. Eisenhower never saw that message either. At the end of the day, the buck stopped at the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. It would be Eisenhower's decision if the Rosenbergs lived or died. Eisenhower's advisors were divided on the issue. There would be many foreign and domestic political implications associated with either choice. Eisenhower's thinking may have been guided by the Cold War mindset of the time. He thought that the Rosenbergs' theft of the bomb had put millions of Americans in danger, a sentiment that was shared by many Americans, especially after Judge Kaufman blamed the Rosenbergs for the Korean War. Some of Eisenhower's thought process was also displayed in a letter he wrote to a friend. It is the known convictions of communist leaders all over the world that free governments are notoriously weak and fearful, and that consequently, subversive and other kinds of activity can be conducted against them with no real fear of dire punishment. Hopefully, executing the Rosenbergs would serve as an effective deterrent against future American communists spying against their own country. Eisenhower was also afraid that granting Ethel leniency based on her gender might result in communists using more women in their spying endeavors. Also, somehow, Eisenhower had gotten the impression that Ethel was the leader of the conspiracy. That's strange. I wonder how he got that impression. Eisenhower mentioned Ernst's psychological study in personal letters. Would Eisenhower have spared Ethel if he wasn't misled about her involvement? Perhaps, but we'll never know for sure, because Eisenhower denied clemency for both of the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs were due to be executed at 11 p.m. on the 19th of June, 1953. The defense argued that given the Rosenbergs' Jewish faith, it would be wrong to execute them on the Sabbath. Judge Kaufman agreed and moved the execution forward 3 hours to occur before sunset. Truly one of the darkest historical examples of malicious compliance. Earlier that day, there had been a march on the American embassy in Paris, where one man died. Outside the White House, there were many protesters, at this time probably more anti-Rosenberg individuals that were celebrating the execution than pro-Rosenberg people, demanding a last-second intervention by Eisenhower. Between 5,000 and 7,000 people were crammed into New York Union Square. There, the atmosphere was much sadder and the government actions had less support. Due to the executions being moved forward, 2 FBI agents were sent to New York to find the executioner and bring him to the prison early. The Rosenbergs also didn't have the time to eat their last meal. They chose to forego it to spend their last few hours together. Bloch sent the Rosenbergs a message from Washington, where he was arguing a last-minute appeal. He said he did the best that he could, and he loved them, and so does the world. The FBI were also making preparations. They had been working on a sizable logistical and legal endeavor. They were ready to stop the executions at any time if the Rosenbergs were willing to confess. This included even after the Rosenbergs had been strapped into the electric chair. The executions would be cancelled and the Rosenbergs would be moved to a nearby facility the FBI had prepared for the Rosenbergs' questioning. A rabbi begged the Rosenbergs to confess for the sake of their children, but they chose not to take him up on that offer. Julius died first. The execution went completely smoothly, but for Ethel, after 3 shocks, she was still alive. She got 2 more shocks for a total of 4 minutes and 50 seconds of electricity flowing through her body. It was a dour mood in Sing Sing, and indeed in the rest of the US. There were some people celebrating the executions, but even many of the people that thought the Rosenbergs were guilty felt no inclination to celebrate the death of the parents of 2 young boys. At this point, the Rosenberg case no longer mattered. No evidence could bring them back to life. But don't you want to know if they are actually guilty? Because we do know.